Hello, I am Changmok Jin from the Hanmaum Church in Chincheon. I want to share with you something earth-shattering that happened in my heart through the amazing work of the Holy Spirit, which was accomplished in only 3 weeks. I used to be an atheist. I thought all I needed to live in this world wasn't money or fame, but a strong self. As long as I did not collapse, I thought I could find a way to survive. That's why I really loved tigers. The toughness of tigers, as they lived, hunted, and protected their territory alone, really appealed to me. My heart would beat loudly just thinking about their power. But by contrast, lions seemed pretty weaselly to me because they lived and hunted in groups. You know the pictures of animals on cereal boxes? Well, I only bought cereals that had a picture of a tiger on the box. I never bought the ones with the lion on it. Sometimes the lion would tempt me a little when there was a buy one get one free deal, but I always chose a tiger with no hesitation. My mind was set in these kind of ideas, and I thought God was someone only weak people believed in, and I could see all the weaknesses the Christians had. They say that you seek God when you feel helpless or experience low points in your life. But I never once tried to seek God, even when I went through rough times like that. As you can see, I had no interest in God. I was even less interested in church. Most of my friends have at least visited a church during their teens for one reason or another. But I thought that just going to church made the person seem weak. So I didn't even go near a church. And when I saw how my friends, my brother-in-law, and my sisters lived as Christians, I thought their lifestyles wasn't for me at all. In the end, it's yourself who has to overcome the difficult situations and circumstances in life, you know. But Christians seem to try to avoid difficult problems and situations by relying on a being called God. With the life I had lived, I couldn't understand these Christians at all. So naturally, God and the church were outside my interests. Here's how uninterested in church I used to be. The first time I went, the pastor was emphasizing the importance of morning prayer services. But I worked in Gangneung, and my church was in Chincheon. That really gave me a dilemma. That was because I didn't know that every single church in Korea had morning prayer service. That was something everyone in Korea knew, even if they didn't go to church. Also, I had no idea that it was fine for me to give worship at a church other than my own. I could have asked anyone, and they would have told me. But I was afraid that they would tell me that I had to come to Chincheon to attend morning prayer service. Then, I'd have to commute 2 hours every morning. Then I decided to just go for it. So I went to church. People who saw me that morning were very surprised. One of them asked, "Why was I here?" And I told him that I was there for morning prayer service. He looked puzzled and said, "Why didn't you just go to morning prayer in Gangneung?" So I said, "Is it okay to attend morning service in Gangneung?" Then he said, "Well, yes. God exists in Gangneung too, doesn't he?" What the heck? I came all the way here for nothing. I didn't say that aloud, but I felt like such an idiot. As you can see, I had no interest in God whatsoever, but God extended his hand to me too. At the time, I ran a restaurant with my sister in Gangneung. We worked for 4 years with no break other than on major holidays. I really wanted a break. It was all I could think about. That's when my mother encouraged me to go to church. Normally, I wouldn't have even considered it. But when I thought about being able to take a break on the weekend, I immediately agreed to go. Of course, I didn't want to go to church at all. I thought I'd just sit there for a short time and then see a friend. I promised my mom that I'd attend the full service. But on my way to church, I changed my mind and insisted on meeting my friend first. I won the argument, so I dropped off my mother at church and headed to Wonju, where my friend lived. I hadn't had this kind of freedom in 4 years. I lit a cigarette, turned up the stereo, and sped across the highway. But it was strange. I should have been happy and excited. But I felt burdened, like I was doing something very wrong. That was just the beginning. Strange things kept happening after that. While I was drinking with my friend, I suddenly blurted out, "What if God exists?" We hadn't been talking about anything related to God, but I kept mentioning God. Not just once, but several times. I couldn't figure out why. You see, we had been friends for 20 years, but we had never talked about God before, not even once. We kept talking about things that we would never have talked about before. We finally passed out around 3 a.m. Then suddenly I woke up at 6 in the morning. I had drunk a lot. But I didn't have a headache at all, and I couldn't go back to sleep. I tried to wake up my friend, but he wouldn't budge. So I just went to church, because I really had nothing else to do. That was how I came to church. For the first time in my life, I was 33 years old. I sat in the very back with a big, ugly scowl on my face. It was my first time at church, first time sitting in the worship hall, and first time listening to praise. But then tears began to flow endlessly from my eyes. I thought you cry when you were really happy or sad. But I was crying even though I wasn't feeling anything. I had never cried so much before in my life. The praises weren't even sad or deeply moving. They were songs like, "Our General, Jesus Christ." But I kept crying and crying, so I couldn't go anywhere, and just had to sit there till sermon time. This was how my first service went, and I heard the gospel. I heard that Jesus rose from the dead. Resurrection. I knew about resurrection. They released that song called Hia. Resurrection is one of Korea's most famous rock bands. And resurrection is what happens to an athlete who makes a comeback. But the sermon was saying that a person had died and then come back to life. It was the first time I had heard anything like this, and it was really shocking to me. Not because I believed what I heard, but because I began to think that if Jesus' resurrection was real, then God must exist. The thought came as a huge shock to me. The resurrection threw all my values into chaos. I had come to church with no real reason, and if I had been told to just believe in God, I wouldn't have listened. But I was being told that I could believe God through specific evidence. So I decided that I'd search for the facts for exactly 1 month. But as I listened and thought about the resurrection more, I realized that it was not something I could believe. How could I believe that someone was raised from the dead without actually seeing it happen? There was absolutely no one in the world who had conquered death. So why was I being told to believe something that could never happen in this world without actually witnessing it? I couldn't understand it all, but if Jesus' resurrection was a fact, God existed for sure. However, I couldn't believe in the resurrection and felt very frustrated. You see, I'm a very impatient person. Although I never listen to others because I'm very stubborn, I immediately read and did everything that was recommended by the church member who was helping me. Even so, I just couldn't believe in the resurrection. I got curious about how other people believed in and thought about the resurrection, so I began searching the internet. It wasn't intentional, but all the sites I happened to visit were anti-Christian sites. At the time, I didn't have the ability to figure out what was what. But there was one thing I could clearly see. Anti-Christians only wrote about how they felt, along with some explicit swearing, but the believers provided evidence to support what they said. For example, about Moses parting the Red Sea, the anti-Christians commented, "Well, did you see it happen?" followed by some very bad words. "Try parting it," they said. "Then I'll believe it happened." Their insults always said something like that. And the believers would provide some kind of evidence, though I don't remember exactly what they were. Seeing this, I realized on which side I should stand. So I started to read the Bible and the resources that Hanmaum Church had published. 2 weeks had passed since I decided to look into this. I searched hard, but I just couldn't believe. I was thinking about giving up. It was really frustrating because of my impatient personality. All I had to do was to search a little more. But I just wanted to give up. But I wanted to go to church just one last time, so I went. I told my sister that I would quit if I didn't get it this time. I thought my sister would not like what I said, but she told me, "Chang-Mok, you have the right heart." At the time, I didn't know what kind of heart she meant. But as I was sitting in the back of the worship hall, I realized that my heart was desperate and sincere. I heard a lot of things in the sermon, but nothing happened to me. I was very disappointed. Then I thought, this is it. I'll quit now. Strangely enough, though I had made up my mind to quit, I couldn't stop thinking about the resurrection after that. When I ate, resurrection. When I watched TV, the resurrection. When I drank, the resurrection. Even when I played games, the resurrection. I was thinking about the resurrection even during my smoke break. I felt like I'd go insane if I heard the "re" in resurrection one more time. I was going nuts. I didn't want to search more about the resurrection. I was done with it, but I kept thinking about the resurrection anyway. So I kept going back and forth between finding out about the resurrection and giving up many times. Then on April 4th, 2006, an earth-shattering miracle happened. It happened at 2 a.m. in the bathroom. I was closing up the restaurant as usual, but suddenly I got an upset stomach. On my way to the bathroom, of course, I thought about the resurrection. I had a copy of some pages of a book that gave a medical explanation of Jesus' sufferings, from when he was whipped to when he died on the cross. I took those pages to the toilet. At first, I read them without much thought. I thought that Jesus' pain when he was dying was brief, like when you were shot by a firing squad or when your throat was cut. But as I read, I realized that when Jesus was whipped and nailed on the cross, he had suffered the kind of pain no human could endure. At that moment, I remembered the disciples who had testified to the resurrection, and everything in me collapsed. The disciples really did see the risen Jesus. Jesus had risen from the dead. I once heard that the word excruciating was created because there was no word that existed to describe such agony. The disciples could never have testified to the resurrection after seeing that kind of pain. Nobody could have testified to the resurrection, knowing that you would die exactly like Jesus did. As the resurrection was confirmed to me, I wept and wept. God, whom I ignored, existed. The young man who had died on the cross was God. I had lived my whole life not believing in him. God had sent his son for a person like me, who had completely ignored him, so that he die on the cross and be raised from the dead, to give me a sure proof of his existence. But I had still neglected him I cried endlessly for the sin of having lived as my own Lord. But what was so strange was that the more I repented the sin, the bigger my joy and freedom got. They were feelings I had never tasted before in this world. I saw that I had been carrying this world's heavy burdens while I lived as my own Lord. And the fact that I had a Lord whom I could trust and rely on for everything in this world made me feel so free. I had a Lord I could trust my worries, my property, and my whole life with. This fact gave me so much freedom. The gospel didn't make me weak. It made me the freest person in the world.
Amen.
After that, there were a lot of changes in my life. I stopped drinking and smoking. I used to be a really foul-mouthed person. I couldn't have a conversation without swearing. But curses disappeared from my lips. I used to be filled with anger, but now I was filled with joy. And friends who swore to be loyal left me when I stopped drinking and testified to the gospel. But I wasn't mad or disappointed in them. My heart was bleeding for them. The biggest change in my life was that I became a person who proclaimed the gospel.
Amen.
It took me some time for my habit of cursing, drinking, and smoking to leave me. It took as long as 3 months for the habits to disappear. But just as Paul immediately testified to the resurrection in chapter 9 of Acts, I also testified to the resurrection the moment I believed in Jesus Christ as my Lord. Since I worked past midnight, my friends used to call me late at night. A friend called me, also on the day I received Christ, and I witnessed the resurrection to him right away. I testified that God existed. Then my friend cursed at me and hung up the phone. From then on, I testified to the gospel any chance I got. Nobody taught me how, and I wasn't doing it because someone told me to. I had no biblical knowledge. I didn't know anything about God's calling. But I testified to my friends and family every day, and even to the customers in my restaurant. I went to nearby campuses every day and testified. Family and friends told me that I was crazy, and that I must have joined a cult. Many people at the campuses came to know who I was. While I was testifying to the gospel every day in the campuses, I'd say, "Hello," and some students would say, "I already heard it yesterday." Some would say, "Jesus is risen," before I even said anything. And some would run away as soon as they saw my face. I sometimes demand at the students, "Why can't you believe when there's such a definite proof, and be the one persecuting them?" There are things I've clearly seen as I preach the resurrection of Jesus. I saw a young student planning suicide come back to life. I saw the salvation of many young students who had been lost in their worries and worldly pleasures. I witnessed a man who had been insincere and refusing to listen to the gospel submit to the risen Lord in 5 minutes. I witnessed young and old people, people of other religions, and even those in heretical groups submitting to the risen Lord. It didn't take any systematic training for me to be a witness of the resurrection, and it doesn't take a long time for people to change.
Amen.
The gospel of the resurrection changed me from an atheist to a man whose Lord is Jesus Christ. The risen Jesus told the disciples, "As God sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world." I wasn't sent into this world to do many things, but only to be a witness of the gospel. I will continue to run the race until the day my Lord returns.
Amen.
Just like the witnesses of the resurrection did, I give all glory to God, who showed me the power of the resurrection through a 21-day miracle. Thank you.